Alright everyone, today we're going to start our exploration of Andrew Jackson, our 7th President of the United States, and more than likely the most divisive president in history. There are still people who see him as kind of the good old Southern boy and a very democratic person who only ruled in the interest of the little guy, But there are others who see him as the most tyrannical person that we've ever had in that office, who's going to move the Indians out to the west, who does what people have been warning him against with the bank, and this guy's rough and tumble. He's participating in duels, and he's just kind of an all-around, he's an individual, definitely an individual in our history as president. So let's go ahead and start to take a look at what makes him so unique and controversial. So the overview, he is going to be our first Democratic president, meaning the first president of the quote-unquote Democratic Party, but also in the other sense is that there's going to be a lot of common people who are going to be voting for Andrew Jackson. Politics are going to change. Before it had been this very regal, educated kind of debate about economics and tariffs and stuffy kind of situations. He's changing that. What does it mean to the people in their houses is essentially what he's going to go after. That impact on American politics plays today. Everybody wants to kind of get to the middle class, even if you're rich. Think of Donald Trump. He was born rich, but he tries to portray himself as kind of this bootstrapping guy who built himself up from the middle class. Right? Every one of your politicians is trying to pander to the middle class or try to get votes from the middle class. And that's coming very much from Andrew Jackson. And the controversies. Moving the Indians, there's going to be a bank crisis that kind of crushes our economy for a while that he plays a big part of. And then there's also the nullification crisis, which has the potential of sparking the Civil War in the 1830s, and the issue being a tariff rather than directly about slavery. Alright, so let's take a look at Jackson as a little kid. He is going to be born in either North Carolina or South Carolina. We don't know which one. We know the date. We know it's March 15th, 1767. So a couple years after the French and Indian War, but before the Revolutionary War has started. We don't know whether it's North Carolina or South Carolina because what happened is his father died 3 weeks before his birth. So they were traveling. His mother had been traveling, had the funeral. She was traveling, trying to get back home, and she had Andrew Jackson somewhere in the Waxhaws region, which is where he lived, but we don't know exactly which side of the border he was born on. He's going to claim later that he was born on the South Carolina side of the line. That he was born in the house of one uncle who was in South Carolina. But thinking of the politics, we're going to get into the politics of Andrew Jackson a little bit later, and one of the crises he has to confront. That may be a little bit of, hey, I'm from South Carolina too. You should listen to me rather than this Calhoun guy. Other people kind of place him with another uncle who lived on the North Carolina side. It doesn't really matter. North Carolina and South Carolina both claim him as being their native son, but he's going to move to Tennessee anyway, and he's going to be a Tennessean. So just like Jackson and Pepsi, he's born in the Carolinas, although we don't know which one. Alright, so Revolutionary War. So Andrew Jackson's becoming a little tough little tyke. He's homeless. His mother is kind of homeless. She's bouncing around, living with family for a little while, and then going and moving and living with another part of the family for a little while. So he's growing up kind of rough and tumble, and he takes on that characteristic a little bit later. And during the Revolutionary War, so he's born in 1767. He's 11 years old, in the height of the American Revolution, around 1777, 1778. When he gets to be about 12, 13, he's going to start running messages for the local militia that are kind of opposing Cornwallis and other royal commanders in North Carolina and South Carolina. The British soldiers are actually going to come to his house and are going to be looking for spies. Now, him carrying messages makes him and his brother spies. So the British officer is going to order him to shine his boots. Jackson takes it as an insult, tells him he's not, and the British officer takes his sword out and slaps him with the blunt side, the flat side of the sword, but it gives Jackson kind of a gash, kind of a scar for the rest of his life. Now, Jackson and his brother are going to be taken prisoner of war for being spies. Now, while they're in this jail, Jackson's mother is trying to gain their release, trying to plead with them that they're just young boys, that they don't know exactly kind of everything they're involved in. Please let them go. Jackson will be released. His brother, Robert, is going to die in prison. The smallpox outbreak in the prison is going to kill a great number. Jackson himself is going to get the smallpox, but smallpox, especially with Europeans, isn't going to be as deadly as remember when we were back in the 1490s. We were talking about smallpox in the native population wiping out 80 to 90% of the people that it touched. The Europeans had a much more well-developed kind of resistance to it, but still, I think it's around 10-15% death rate from smallpox. So Robert will die from it. Jackson will survive. But he's just kind of gotten one reason to hate the British. Now, while Jackson was being released from prison, his mother had gone to Charleston, South Carolina, to kind of help their case by working as a nurse on board British ships. And while she's up there, she's going to die of cholera. So there goes a second reason to really hate the British. And he's going to take this distrust and this animosity towards the British to the bank later. And we know, I've already kind of discussed when we were going over the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans, that's where his fierceness against the British comes from. Right. His formative years, he's going to be known for having a bad temper. He's going to be fighting multiple duels. He is going to grow up in that western part of North Carolina along the frontier. Eventually, he will become a self-taught lawyer and a teacher. So he'll practice law in Salisbury for a bit, but immediately move to the Western District of North Carolina, which will become the Southwest Territory or Tennessee. So he's one of the founders, one of the kind of like that founding group of people moving into Tennessee. And one of the big things is when you're moving into a new territory, that's opportunity. And it's definitely something that Jackson is going to take. He's very opportunistic about moving to Tennessee. So when he gets out there, he kind of sets up a small farm right outside of what we have today, we know today as Nashville. He's going to call it the Hermitage. So in 1804, he builds a log cottage. That's going to be 2 stories tall. He marries Rachel Donaldson. We might talk about that a little bit more later. But while he's building, you've got to remember Nashville is the frontier, so this 2-story log cottage is very strong. It's built well. It's made to defend against native attacks. And he's going to have 9 slaves, and he's going to have a small cotton farm. As the farm gets larger, he builds another house. He takes down the old cottage, and he builds new slaves' quarters with the old cottage. Also, I want to kind of point out, everybody has this idea that all plantations were based in cotton or tobacco. Now, the Hermitage is going to have cotton, and cotton is going to become a more prominent part of the Hermitage as time goes on. But in the 1820s, 1830s, it's mainly a racehorse breeding operation. Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina are known for their racehorses, as well as Maryland. And this was a pastime of plantation owners in the South, was to get together and have races, bet on those horses. If you think about the Kentucky Derby today, it's got a lot of the Old South in it. The big hats, the drinks, in the stands, very gentlemanly sport, watching the horses race. So there's a lot of money to be built on these racehorses. And that's what Jackson is considered his passion at the time. He's still going to be a lawyer, but he's going to have his plantation with racehorses, cotton, and he designs Hermitage. He buys the perfect place for his plantation because it's between two rivers. The Cumberland River is 2 miles, and then the Stones River is 2 miles away. So it's really easy to get whatever he needs to wherever he wants. He will not live at the Hermitage full time until he retires after the presidency. His son, his adopted son, Andrew Jr., is going to be kind of managing the plantation. Doesn't do a great job of it, but it still will be there for him to kind of take over. The other thing I want to point out about the Hermitage is it is a plantation. The number of slaves grows over time. And the other thing about it is during these presidential elections, people are going to hammer Jackson for not being a plantation owner, because that's nothing new for the time, and it's not really seen as appalling. But people are going to criticize Jackson for being a plantation owner whose large amount of the income that comes from his plantation is for the sale of slaves. The Upper South, and we'll talk about this again, but the Upper South is essentially, by the 1830s, 1840s, they have more slaves than they can use in the fields, so they would actually start selling slaves off to gain more money. And thinking about what that means, breaking up of families. So there are a lot of people starting to criticize that, and they're definitely criticizing Jackson for doing that when he's running for office. Now, Jackson, before he becomes a politician, he is a military guy as well. He's got multiple hats. He's a plantation owner, he's a lawyer, he was a teacher, he's fighting duels, but he's also going to be a commander of the Tennessee militia, Colonel Jackson. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend, we mentioned when we were talking about the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans. Those are going to raise his reputation because more than anybody else during the war, he does more to defeat the Indians. Well, William Henry Harrison maybe could challenge him on that. But the Battle of New Orleans was defeating the British. Nobody was better at defeating the British during the War of 1812 than Andrew Jackson. Nobody was better at defeating the natives. Like I said, maybe William Henry Harrison. But coming out of that war, George Washington's been 30 years removed from office. Nobody's really talking about him as a hero much anymore. Right? They've got to see somebody walking and breathing to consider them heroic. Jackson cuts a very imposing figure up here. Now, this is a painting. He's probably not on top of the cotton bales with the sword like that, but it kind of shows how heroic he is during the Battle of New Orleans. All right, the First Seminole War, he's still going to kind of command U.S. forces. A little bit later, what we're having, all right, so when the British pull out of the War of 1812, they had been preparing natives and runaway slaves to attack Georgia as part of their invasion to help them take the United States. When they leave, they had created this fort in Florida, in Spanish Florida, called the Negro Fort. What they're going to do is when they leave, they don't destroy the fort. They don't take the weapons from the Seminole and from the runaway slaves that had gone to that fort. They allow them to keep their weapons. They allow them to keep the fort, which should set off alarm bells for you if you're from the South. Couple 30, 40 miles away from the Georgia border, there is now a fort with runaway slaves and Seminole Indians that can cross over at any time and start a war with Georgia, freeing more slaves, attacking plantation owners. This strikes fear into the South. So Jackson and other people decide it has to be dealt with. So there are going to be some attacks along the border, and Jackson is going to use that as a reason to invade Spanish Florida. This is a completely illegal act of war. But in our response to the Spanish are going to be very upset. Hey, why are you invading our territory? This is ours. You're not supposed to be on our side of the fence. But essentially what Jackson and John Quincy Adams are going to argue, hey, you're not being able to kind of control your people. Right? You're not controlling them from coming over to our side. So if you're not going to handle the issue, we definitely will. So Jackson invades Spanish Florida. He torches the Negro Fort. He creates another bigger fort, a U.S. fort called Fort Gadsden. He goes over to Tallahassee, has a battle near St. Mark's, goes over to Pensacola, and basically West Florida. He is invaded and he is captured for the United States. But here's the issue. We invaded Spanish Florida. We can either fight them for it or we can buy it. Now, John Quincy Adams, our Secretary of State at the time, had already been engaged in trying to buy Spanish Florida peacefully from them. The Spanish hadn't really concentrated on Florida, and now they're having problems in other parts of their empire starting to break off in independence movements. So maybe we can kind of detach Florida from them, give them some money so they can go and use that while they're fighting these wars, and everybody's happy, and we remove another neighbor from one of our borders. But now Jackson has really complicated that, because they are ticked off about what he has just done. But John Quincy Adams puts that argument, hey, you haven't been controlling your people. We want to make sure we're safe. If that means we have to take Florida from you, we are going to take Florida from you. But we'd rather buy it from you. And we get the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819. The United States is going to be able to buy Florida for $5 million. Now, we're going to have to clean up some of our claims to Texas. We're going to be giving up a little bit of our territory in that Louisiana Purchase to Spain. That's okay. We get what we want. Florida is the goal. $5 million, we have it. Now, here goes the election of 1824, and actually we're going to save that for part 2. So the next video is going to cover essentially the elections and Jackson's 2 terms in office.